Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 308 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I am delighted to catch up with Dr. Jessica J. Clapham, who is a senior lecturer and programme director of the Professional Doctorate in English Language Teaching at the University of Wales, Trinity St David. She's also a mentor at the Women's Mentoring Scheme at Bangor University and is a qualified counsellor with 28 years of experience working with groups with diverse needs and more recently in the field of writing and well-being using an integrative approach which builds on person-centred therapy. Today, Dr. Jessica is going to talk about the process of creating writing in therapy and the benefit to well-being. So with that said, let's get on with today's episode.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
A very warm welcome from Rory and myself to Counselling Tutor Podcast. It's episode 308, and we are so happy to be returning back from some well-earned rest. It's been the academic break here in the United Kingdom, and we've got three exciting topics that we're going to be covering for you today, starting off with our ethical, sustainable practice, where we're delving into trauma grounding techniques for you within your practice. We then move on to Practice Matters, where, as Rory has already introduced, he spoke with Dr. Jessica J. Clapham, and that's all about writing and well-being. And then we go into our student services, where we welcome all of the students that are starting the new academic year, and we're going to be speaking about trauma, what you need to know as a counselling student. So, Rory, here we are back after the break. I hope that you find yourself well rested as we kind of check in for episode 308 today.
Absolutely, Ken. I'm quite excited. Actually, there's something quite exciting about going back to school and starting again and engaging with the new term and the new year. So very well rested and really excited. Some great topics to discuss today as well.
Indeed. And speaking of great topics, we're going to start off looking at our ethical, sustainable practice. And we're talking about trauma grounding techniques. Now, I wonder, Rory, if you can kind of just give us a quick overview of what do we mean by trauma grounding techniques?
Well, these are things you can do. These are actions you can take should your client disassociate in the room. And what do we mean about disassociation? Well, it means usually an escape to the past. When someone's disassociating, it means they're going back to the time of the trauma. In other words, they've literally got themselves a time machine, an emotional time machine, and they're traveling back in time. And they're experiencing all the emotions, and sometimes they may be able to physically see the situation that's going on. So a trauma grounding technique or techniques, there's a number of them, are ways that a therapist can bring the client back to equal and present time, to bring the client into the here and the now, because that's where the work is done. If clients are living in the past, are still experiencing the past, then then it's quite difficult to do any meaningful work with them. So I think most therapists would agree that by bringing people into the here and now, prioritizing safety and security and containment, that you can work with the emerging issues from the trauma and keep them safe, for want of a better word, Ken.
I think that is so beautifully said, Rory. A real nice overview of that. So it's kind of when recognizing that a client of ours might be experiencing a past traumatic event, it's kind of bringing them back into the here and now, and there are grounding techniques that are really good at doing that. And I think that we can start off by exploring when we might use trauma-informed grounding techniques with clients. And as you say, Rory, if you maybe see that disassociation, you may introduce a grounding technique. But I'm also mindful that if we know that we're going into some pretty traumatic material with a client, that grounding techniques can bookend that. We can kind of start the session just with a grounding technique, bringing that client into the here and now, maybe bringing them into a more relaxed state before we start exploring what they choose to bring. And of course, that's if we have a heads up that they may be bringing something that is trauma related, of Rory.
Yes, well, I mean, it's not unusual for clients to not disclose what's happened to them, to talk broadly around the issues of the past. But there may come a point in the therapeutic relationship where a client wants to disclose. It's sometimes known as disclosing in trauma practice circles. And in that case, it's really important, I think, that first of all, we contract for that. We have another contract. And it's worth reminding ourselves that therapy is a very contractual process, and that we can have contracts for certain things outside our initial contract. So we make an initial contract, things, availability, payment, that type of thing. But we can in-session contract. So if someone is talking about disclosing, I think a conversation about, how the therapist can support the client, what the therapist may do, even a little bit of psychological education, to just give the client a heads up that when disclosing, they may find themselves drifting into the past. And you asked the question, Ken, how do we know? Well, when we work with a client, we get a good sense of the here and now of this client, at the equal and present time. And as a consequence of that, if a client's behavior changes, their affect changes, how they present themselves, that's a good indication. And I'll give you an example. So you have a client you've been working with. We'll call her Jessica for want of a better name. And what happens is that she decided to talk about the events that's happened to her, and all of a sudden you notice that her body language change, her voice changes. So you may hear a voice that is slightly more childish, and that's an indication that someone is slipping back in time. They're slipping back into the time where the trauma happened. And once that happens, and once that brain engages, that part of the brain engages, then if it's not arrested, if you're not working in a trauma-informed way, the client may very well find themselves stuck in that place. So an intervention to be able to bring the client back into the here and now, to acknowledge that what's happened in the past, that the threat's no longer there. I think that's really important, for some people who've had very bad childhood experiences, to acknowledge and to affirm that the threat's no longer there. So those are a few of the indications that we can see if a client is sliding back, and some of the negotiations and contracting we can use to help the client remain in the here and the now.
100%. And it's that is if you have an indication that the client may be bringing some material that is particularly heavy or that may cross it into traumatic experiences. The other side of that is when it's not kind of clearly indicated, because as you know, Rory, trauma is not always some past event that was absolutely life-changing in every single way. I'm thinking, when we think of trauma, it can be a conversation that you had with somebody, can trigger trauma and sit as trauma within the body. And I know that when we are looking maybe for telltale signs to be able to indicate that we should maybe use some trauma grounding techniques, we would look out for fight or flight. We would look at shutdown, and in fight or flight, and this is from the amazing handout and article that has been written on this, which we'll direct you to in a moment. We're looking maybe raised shoulders, maybe the person is fidgeting more than they normally would, showing some kind of something is there. There's some kind of a tension within. There may be wide eyes, there may be shallowness of breathing, and this can kind of indicate a fight or flight. I need to get out of here now. I'm not comfortable at the moment. And of course, on the other side of that is almost the flip side of the coin. It's the shutdown, which is a way of dealing. The body deals, I guess, with extreme emotional stress and trauma, and that would be maybe the person appearing dead, almost emotionless. Out of character, emotionless in your session room. They may have a collapsed posture, so their body is kind of slumped down. They may look sad, almost like they're experiencing deep sadness or grief, Rory. Is there anything else that we should be looking out for to kind of give us the indicator that now is a good time to maybe turn to a grounding technique?
Yes, I mean, there's a term that's been used for a long time. It's usually attached to the military, and it's called the 1,000-yard stare. And it's when someone is just staring into the middle distance as if they're looking at something 1,000 yards away, even though they sat in the room. And that is a good indication that they are kind of in that traumatic situation. And also, people may start to cry. People may start to sob. People actually, I've known people try to leave the room. The flight is so strong that they literally try to flee the room, and I'd say that was very unusual, but I know it's happened certainly to colleagues of mine. So those are the kind of things we're looking for, and as I say, it's really important that we support the client. We're there for the client in every way, and are able to not only bring them back into the here and now, but for ourselves to act as a regulator, for ourselves to be that regulating influence, to be that calm influence in the room. And I think that's something that's not really talked about a lot. There's two people in the room. One of those people has to be totally regulated, has to be able to model regulation, but also for the client to look to the therapist and feel that there is safety. Patricia Clarkson talks about the repatriative style. In other words, that part of the parent that says when a child's frightened, it's okay. There's nothing to fear now. So, yes, that kind of thing can a change in effect and a change in the normal behaviour of the client, I guess.
Yes, and I like how you've kind of crossed there. It's almost a grounding technique in itself of how we present as the counsellor within the therapy session. We can be a grounding anchor there. And now what I'd like to do is kind of explore the different types of grounding techniques. So within the article that has been written on this, which is Grounding Techniques for Trauma-Informed Therapy, we cover orienting. So this is kind of breath work as an example of that. There are 6 different grounding techniques that are shared in the article. We're not going to go into them now. You can go and have a look at that. We'll give you the link at the end of this little session here of where you can find that and get the handout for them. But Rory, I wonder if you can talk us through what is actually happening with orienting that client. I know that it's bringing them into the here and now. We might use breath work to do that. Can you give an example of what we might use and what that does for the client, Rory?
Yes, well, part of helping to regulate is regulate the physical side of our bodies. It's not just the mind; it's the entire ecosystem of our bodies. So using breath work, things like breathing techniques, breathe in, count to 4, breathe out, count to 4. That can very much help the flow of cortisol and the adrenaline that cortisol triggers. So when we're in a kind of fight or flight situation, our body produces cortisol, and that sets our brain into a certain path. And then at a certain time, we'll find adrenaline pumps. People shake, or people may feel like they need to run away. So if we can arrest that, as I say, by using something like maybe a hand on the heart technique, place one hand on the heart and the other on the forehead, and breathe deeply until a sense of calm is achieved. And I think if the therapist models that, I'm doing it now. I've got my hand on my head and I'm breathing deeply. And what will happen is that the physiological side of the body will start to regulate the brain. So that's one technique. The other, of course, is the butterfly hug, where you cross your arms over the chest and the opposite shoulder and gently tap yourself. Just gently tap yourself. And that's a way of regulating. And I think it's very useful that the therapist teaches this, introduces it, teaches it. And I think crucially, Ken, that they may just teach it before the client goes in to any difficulty. So it's no good teaching people how to use a life raft when the ship's sinking. You need to teach people how to use a life raft, as part of just the general part of sailing in a ship. And, if you're working with trauma, I think it might be useful, if you think that the client may be struggling, or they say they may struggle, to introduce those techniques first, and maybe get them to practice them at home generally as something they could take away and use in their everyday life.
Yeah, and I see you. I mean, we start with orienting, which is kind of directing the attention to the present moment, and in looking at the breath. So we said when we were looking for the signs that we might see a shallowness in breathing or a quick pace in breathing. By bringing attention to the breath and using a breathing technique, and you outlined one there beautifully, Rory, and there's another breathing technique, which is count of 4 in, hold for the count of 4, out for the count of 4, hold that for the count of 4, in for the count of 4. You're engaging the brain, the thinking. I have to think about that. I have to be here in the present moment to control that breathing. Suddenly I'm controlling the breathing rather than it having happening subconsciously. And that really can bring somebody into the here and now. You mentioned some of the containment techniques as well. Now, containment is really helping a client feel safe within their own body. The thing about trauma is that the person doesn't feel safe even within their own body. And that's a horrible place to be, because there is nowhere to go in
Absolutely.
that. Now, containment brings the person to feel safe in their own body. And you mentioned the butterfly hug. It's kind of just crossing your hands over. And that kind of almost feels like I'm being held or contained. And then the tapping, and you can tap 2 times on one side, 2 times on the other side. Again, we're now involving the brain. I need to think about this. We're giving the brain a job to do that is not running away with the story that happened in the past. It's in the here and now. I feel contained. I feel held. It's almost like I'm being hugged, but it's myself hugging. And I'm giving concentration on what I'm doing for the client to bring them into the here and now. And, clients may share that they sometimes experience panic attacks or high anxiety. This is a great technique that can be given to a client, that can be used in any kind of situation. As you said, Rory, it's a little difficult to teach that when somebody is within the traumatic event and they're lost in that. You don't you don't teach the life raft when you're on the sea unless you really have to.
Unless
and of course we've already mentioned that psychological entertainment, education, not entertainment, that's also a grounding technique, because you're kind of saying it's okay to feel this way. Sometimes with trauma, as we've kind of touched on, perhaps the trauma wasn't some massive traumatic event like a car accident. It could have just been a conversation. And very often a client may feel silly for feeling those levels of anxiety just over a conversation they had. And just normalizing that and making it okay can act as a grounding technique there. And then, of course, Rory, I think we should put in movement and how important movement can be as a grounding technique, Rory.
Absolutely. And I think the thing with grounding is the clue really is in the name. So if a client, if a client wants to tap their foot onto the floor, that's grounding. And as Ken has rightly observed, what these techniques are is to try to keep the top of the brain, the cerebral cortex, engaged, because in trauma, what happens is that the limbic system, the middle part of the brain, takes executive control. So here's an example. You are rushing around trying to get out of the house and you can't find your car keys. And you run around, you get more and more stressed. You can't find your car keys anywhere. And eventually you just give up and sit down and you start to calm down. And then all of a sudden you see the car keys on the table. What's happened there is your brain has got into a stress mode. That middle brain has taken command. The top of the brain hasn't really able to identify or think the solution through where these keys are. And it's only when you take a step back, sit down, that top brain then re-engages, and then you think, oh, I'll put them on the table all the time, and then you feel silly, and then you get in your car and drive off. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this think, I do that all the time. I know I do. So with things like movement, what you're doing is you're engaging the whole body. So people can tap or drum or move the feet or walk around. I've had clients walk around when they're feeling that there's an anxiety attack. Walk around, but also crucially, what it does, the movement engages the entire brain, because the entire brain is involved in the moving, the walking, the navigating, not walking into walls, not falling over, and that then kind of controls that middle part of the brain where the stress lives, and it becomes a little bit more manageable. So that's why movement's important.
It is, Rory, and you're speaking about movement. If you think about a counselling session, it's rare that a client would stand up and walk around within the room. There's almost, we need to give permission. We need to set the stage for that. This is co-regulation with us, indicating that it's okay to do so. You might say something like, it kind of looks like you have a lot of pent-up energy. I wonder if walking around might calm you down. You could do a breathing technique as the person is walking. You can say, walk around the room, stretch your legs, and let's do a 1, 2, 3, 4 breathing exercise, something like that. You can mix and match these and bring them together. And at the end of the day, you're really looking to bring that client into the here and the now. There's a lot more that is discussed in the article, Roy, but we're kind of running at our time limit for this section. So I think trauma is a complex topic. We run a specialist training certificate in trauma. If you're interested in that, you can get all the information by just going to counsellingtutor.com. The handout from today's episode is Trauma-Informed Grounding Techniques, Essential Tools for Therapy. And you can get that by just going to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, go to episode 308, and right there on that page is the link to a really detailed article on this topic and a handout that you can kind of download and reference. And of course, if you're interested in that trauma training, counsellingtutor.com, go and have a look at that. Download the handbook. You'll see it's quite comprehensive. There is a lot to cover in trauma. And the thing is, Rory, one thing I know for sure is that trauma walks into every single therapy room at some stage, more often than I guess we would hope.
Yes, and I think with the world that we live in, it's becoming more and more recognised, more and more seen, and clients, I think, are more educated on it. I think clients may very well come to your therapy room and talk about it. It wasn't the case many years ago when I trained, because it wasn't as discussed as much. It wasn't highlighted as much. So if you are working with clients, trauma-informed practice is, I think it's pretty much an essential, Ken.
Indeed it is. So there it is. That is our ethical, sustainable practice. We now move out of ethical, sustainable practice. We're going to practice matters, Rory. And in today's episode, you met up with Dr. Jessica J. Clapham, and you spoke about writing and well-being. What can we expect from this interview?
Well, I'm always excited to speak with outliers in our profession, people who take a different positioning and approach therapy in a different way. And in this interview, I speak with Dr. Jessica Clapham, who is a linguist and uses language in therapy in the way of creative writing or writing. And a very interesting, a very different way of approaching a therapy. I caught up with her, and this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
There are many different ways of facilitating a client's process. Some therapists may use plays or figurines or music or even photographs. However, there is a growing edge developing in the use of journaling and creative writing to help clients delve a little deeper and dive a little deeper into their own psyche and their own process, which is why I'm delighted to be talking today with Dr. Jessica J. Clapham, who is, I'm going to use the word expert in applied linguistics. And she's going to be talking today about the use of journaling or writing in therapy. So, Dr. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Rory. Thank you for the invitation. We met up at a recent conference at Bangor University, and I was delighted to get this invitation because I think this is a growing field and it's something I feel very passionately about. Thank you.
Yes. Well, yes. Yes, we did meet at Bangor University. So yes, it was a chance meeting, but one that's, I think, is going to be quite important, really, because we're talking about a very important subject. So writing and well-being, writing is not something we'd immediately think about maybe in counselling. A lot of people think counselling is like people talking about their issues. So why is writing important? What is it that you can get from writing that maybe you couldn't get from speaking?
You mentioned my background in applied linguistics. I have actually been a teacher educator for many years. And of course, one of the lectures I give is the power of literacy. And when young children learn to write, what they're doing is they're claiming their identity, but also what we do as young adults and then into later life, we use writing to think. So writing is a process which enables us to through our thoughts, but also to record and recognize our feelings. So this started really as a love of writing as a child, particularly influenced by poetry and other forms of literature. But it then developed into bringing groups together and working online, facilitating people who were feeling a bit vulnerable and isolated during lockdown. And then friends invited me then to take groups, particularly in the community, and encourage people to rediscover the power of writing as part of the therapeutic process.
It sounds absolutely fascinating. And you mentioned during lockdown, was it particularly helpful for people during that very difficult period in 2020 when people were effectively locked in their own homes to be able to put pen to paper or keyboard to screen, as we might do now, to write about their emotions and what was feeling? I guess what I'm asking, can writing bring out more emotion and uncover more of the person than perhaps just speaking about it?
Well, I'm drawing on experts in the field, so people like Graham Hartill, John Killick, these people have recognised the power of writing. What we do is create a space for participants to explore their own feelings in response to either a piece of poetry or indeed image. And they create their own writing as part of this response. They can choose to share it. But what it does, I think, it accesses the subconscious. So it encourages people to actually explore those feelings that they might find difficult to articulate. Obviously, the talking therapies are something that we've trained to do. But I think just as art therapy can connect people directly to their emotions, I think writing can be a very reflective process, and it can actually help people to communicate their feelings.
Yes, and some people may, certainly those maybe in the neurodivergent community may find writing easier than actually speaking. It is actually tailoring your practice to the client, meeting them where they are.
Exactly. And of course, the group is supportive. I did work with online groups, and, there were some people who were under complete lockdown. There were some elderly people who hadn't seen anybody for many, many months. And this was a weekly invitation for them to explore their own writing and to listen to other people's contributions. There was a particular process that was involved. Yes,
and in terms of that process, is there if you're a group facilitator, is there a kind of agreement or contract or some kind of process that you follow? I mean, obviously you can't have everybody sharing their writing all at one time. Are there kind of ground rules to this, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yes, absolutely. Basically, there are 6 steps within the poetry therapeutic writing. This is really from Arlene Hines and Leela Weisberger from the United States. So the idea is to read a piece of writing, first of all. It could be a poem, it could be a piece of a novel, an extract from a novel, and there could be images with it. And you're identifying the themes and the issues and the sentiments within that piece of work. So that's the first step. Then you explore your feelings. So there might be a 6-minute writing opportunity where you ignore the punctuation, the spelling, you have free rein to let your imagination literally run wild. And then the idea is you create a response to the piece of writing. And then there's a stage which is called juxtaposing, where you consider the response of other people. So you move down the circle, and then the next stage is reframing. So in the light of new ideas and thoughts and insights, then you try and put some positive change into action. So it's really exploring those deep feelings, comparing how you feel now as to how you felt before, but also making a movement towards change, really. So it's quite an intricate process.
It sounds like it, and it sounds to me like what you're doing, certainly in the group setting, is harnessing the power of the group. In other words, the group feedback is therapeutic, hopefully therapeutic or awareness raising in itself.
Absolutely. I think what's interesting is people might listen for a long time. We've had people who have had a lot of trauma in their lives, and just by connecting within the group, they may not say anything for the first 3 or 4 weeks, but then sometimes you get this revelatory moment where they feel ready, and it might just be a few words and phrases that they choose to share with the group. And it's amazing how responsive other people can be and how supportive. So that's always a wonderful moment when somebody finds their voice, literally.
Yes, and just thinking about it, we often think about therapy as people coming to talk about their issues, but for some people that's mightily difficult. To be able to speak. It might be easier to take a more circuitous route and use the writing as a kind of vehicle to be able to get them into a position where they can actually speak about what's going on. It's a very interesting process. I'm fascinated by it. As someone who really struggles to write because I'm neurodivergent, I think this is wonderful. I often I'm awestruck by people who can write. I've got a colleague who writes beautifully, and it's like magic. It literally is like magic.
The point is also, Rory, is it's for everybody. I often get people who come to these workshops who say, I hated English lit at school. I couldn't remember the poems, or, they made us learn things by rote. I didn't feel engaged at school. School wasn't for me. But then they kind of rediscover a way of connecting with their own writing, which makes it meaningful. So there's that focus on meaning, really. There's a lovely book that I was reading with a close friend recently about climbing. And it's not about, being the first person to Everest, whether it's a man or a woman or whoever, or being, climbing to the top without oxygen. It's actually about experiencing the place, isn't it? And a key phrase from that piece of writing is, let the mountain climb you.
Yes.
And I think that's really part of this purpose.
Yes, it's the journey, not the destination. That phrase comes up so much in counselling and therapy, doesn't it? It's not the end goal.
Does.
It's the journey and the preambles one takes off that journey. It's yes. Amazing. As a therapist, I've seen clients who've had distinct goals they want to do. Yet when they start on that quest, if you like, what happens is that they actually find side roads or side preambles, and they go off and they might end up somewhere else quite beautiful.
Absolutely. It's a different perspective, isn't it?
It is.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. And of course it has its own responsibility. So as a poetry therapist or as a practitioner, a counsellor using poetry therapy, you need to establish that trust, obviously that relational depth, but also you're taking your clients on a journey, and it's really important to return them back to their own world. So it's about being energetic, being confident, being enthusiastic about writing, but also it's about making sure that you're not just dealing with unconditional positive regard, but unconditional self-regard. So it's about really focusing on that self-compassion. And that does come out a lot when they are reading their own writing.
Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? So when we think of unconditional positive regard, I think a lot of people listening may very well think this is about the therapist offering unconditional positive regard, but actually developing that within the person who's doing the writing, or the client, we'll call them for this for the point of this, is something different. The fact that they can use writing to give themselves affirmation and support, maybe.
Definitely. And of course, people have their favourite writers. I should say at this point, it's not for everybody. Some people might find art a little bit more approachable, or music, but it's a way of offering that, that access to the subconscious, really. But I do find that people often reflect on poetry they haven't read for years. If they've been through a very difficult time, they might find listening to music or even listening to poetry quite difficult. But once they regain that confidence by writing about themselves, I think it is very empowering, and it's a kind of transformation, really. You can see it in front of your very own eyes, really.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in therapy training, we're really encouraged to journal and actually write about our thoughts and our feelings. And that, in my experience as a tutor, that's quite transformative when people can write about what's going on. Because I guess, I wonder, should I say, I'm curious, if that is about the fact that when using the pen, they have full control about what goes on the paper. They can choose to write things down or not. And that might be something that they've not experienced in their life. If they've been subject to traumatic experiences where things have been out of their control, the power to be able to hold a pen and say, I'm going to write about this or not, can be quite transformative in my experience.
Absolutely. To use the Buddhist philosophy, it's about integrating heart and mind. And I think this is something that I realised quite early early on, maybe as a very young child, by recording your stories, your poems, you were there exploring, the imagination was taking you on a journey, but also it's about processing, isn't it? And often people tell me they do write a daily journal. Sometimes people just record the weather or how they were feeling at a particular type of day. It doesn't have to be detailed. The very fact of putting pen to paper can actually, focus them for the future, encourage them to let go of unwanted feelings or unwanted anxiety. And of course, the business world has got in on this. We've now got professional journals that you can buy, and you just fill in it almost like a timetable. So, for example, there's one here, and there's a picture of the impossible jar. So you write down your thoughts, the limiting thoughts, and then, of course, it links to growth mindset, where you have a possibility mindset. So, big business are getting into this, I can see, but I don't think you need all that. Basically, you just need a pen and paper.
Yes.
You just need to have a nice little book that is yours, that's for your eyes only, and it's something you can take with you. You can pop it into a handbag or into your rucksack. And what's interesting, I live in a very beautiful part of Wales, in Snowdonia, but I often meet people who go walking and climbing, and they are very keen writers because obviously it's linked to observation.
Yes. And I guess there's a lot of stimulus there as well. If you having just visited Wales, I mean, everywhere you look, it's just so beautiful and so contrasting that I'm sure that stimulates, writing and reflection. If everybody lives
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we're going back to the Romantic poets, aren't we? We've got family over in the Lake District, and of course that's really the genesis of a lot of these ideas, isn't it? Realizing that you're this tiny little person and nature is so vast. But it's also tuning in to that sentiment of the Romantic poets, people like Wordsworth and Shelley, and a lot of their focus is about remembering, isn't it, and being tuned to nature.
Yes,
so it's recapturing that childhood enthusiasm, I think.
It is, yes, that kind of awe of the world where you realise things. It kind of wears off as you get older. It has for me. But just revisiting these things again. I've got a little, my granddaughter's 4, so she's seeing these things through fresh eyes for the time. So I'm vicariously becoming excited and awestruck by just being with her. Yes.
Oh, fantastic. One of my favourite poets is a woman called Joy Harrow, who has, really talked about First Nations culture and in her poetry. And one of her poems starts, "Remember the sky that you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. Remember the moon. Know who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn. That is the strongest point of time." And it carries on. But it is literally about this reconnecting, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's been a fascinating conversation. And I think one that is important, there's, having worked in mental health for a good few years, creative writing groups have always been an aspect of the offer within recovery and mental health. So very, very important. So Dr. Jessica Clapham, thank you so much for joining us.
So that is our Practice Matters. We now slide out of Practice Matters and we recognise you, our students. This is the Student Services section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting. And it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counselingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at, gain the competence, and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counselingskillsacademy.com. And today we're going to carry on the theme of today's podcast and stick to a little bit of trauma, like we started off with, but trauma and what a student needs to know. Rory, what would a student need to know? Because, of course, a student might not work with deep trauma, but trauma may present itself in training or in placement.
Absolutely. Well, as we said at the top of the episode, trauma is something that's talked about more. It's something that presents more. And in terms of training, there are quite a few areas where we may come across trauma. So I guess one of them is skills practice. Every student who ever practices counselling ends up in a triad. 3 people. There's a speaker, someone who's effectively the client, usually say the speaker, the helper, someone who plays the role of the counsellor, and an observer, someone observes. And in my experience, it's not unusual for someone to talk about something quite mundane, maybe a trip to work. Tutors will say, just talk about, maybe your trip into college. But sometimes that can trigger traumatic memories. And it may be that as a student, you are that person who's talking about a trip into college, and all of a sudden an intrusive memory and a traumatic event comes into your mind, and you might find yourself in some difficulty. Also, if you're the person who's the listener or playing the role of the counsellor, it may be that you're working with someone and all of a sudden they start to get very upset, very disassociated. So that's one definite area where trauma can present. And also for those in practice, if you're practicing counselling, if you're doing your placement hours, almost certainly you are going to meet clients who are traumatised. Now, in theory, there should be a triage in placement. So clients who are, and I'm going to use the inverted commas, I'm doing air commas here, complex, are usually given to more experienced therapists, and the worried well are placed with students. But more and more, certainly in my postbag, I'm seeing that students are working with clients with trauma. And that can be very difficult, because if you've not trained in it, or you're not understanding what's going on, I think that can be quite frightening for a student therapist in practice, and maybe leave the student de-skilled, which is never a good thing. If someone comes back feeling de-skilled, then that needs to be addressed. I think as a tutor, I'd address that and help them kind of realise their skill set, their power, their effectiveness in therapy. But those are just 2 examples, and there are many more, Ken.
Yeah, of course. And the reason we're speaking about this topic is twofold. Well, number one, because you're likely to see it. Even in you either experience it or see it during your counselling studies, in your counselling placement. And the other reason why we're covering this is because if you're listening to this podcast in real time, Rory will be doing a lecture. It's free to attend, and it's being held on the 15th of September. So if you're listening in real time as this podcast comes out, you got time, and you can register for that. There's no charge for it, and it is a certified lecture as well, so you'll get a certificate for attending that lecture. And it is the topic, what we've said, it's trauma, what a student needs to know, 15th of September. And if you want to register for that, go to counselingtutor.com/live, L-I-V-E, as in a live lecture that we are putting out. And in that, you're going to learn to understand what trauma is and what happens within the brain when trauma is playing out. You're going to learn some regulation techniques, and that's practical self-management strategies that can work for yourself or that you can share with a peer. And you're also going to improve your ability to be able to recognize and self-manage in triggering situations. And I'm going to give an example of that, Rory. You might be in a simulated skill session where your tutor said, break up into groups of 3, you're in triads now. Anybody within that triad can experience trauma from a topic that is brought up. And it may touch on something that somebody has experienced in their past and cause a reaction, that past becomes present in the present moment, and the person starts experiencing a reaction to that trauma, becoming anxious. So you're going to learn kind of something that you can share for use on yourself, or maybe share with your peers on your training course, or maybe share with a placement client if you are in placement. And then, of course, there's the self-care aspect of this as well, gaining the insights into vicarious trauma and how it can arise during your counselling studies. And I think that's important. Can you kind of give us an outline, just Rory, of what vicarious trauma is and where we might see that cropping up, not even in a real counselling situation, just in a class, maybe practicing skills, or maybe a topic or a subject that is brought up by the tutor?
Yes, well, I mean, the vicarious trauma effectively is acquired trauma. So, for those who have been following the news in the UK regarding the terrible situation, the stabbing of three children in a northern town in the north of England. People watching that, there'll be some people watching that on the TV or listening to the news who will be traumatized by it. And I genuinely hope by mentioning it on the podcast that people aren't, but it is in the news. So vicarious trauma is where someone sees an event or is present at an event, or may even be, in terms of being a therapist, hear someone's testimony. When we're working with clients, they may tell us things that are very, very difficult to hear, and we may carry their story and share the trauma of it. It becomes part of us. So those are some of the areas where we may find ourselves in what's called vicarious trauma. And I think the research kind of bears out that the more you are exposed to traumatic situations, the more likely you are to gain vicarious trauma. So those are two examples, Ken. There's many more.
Of course. And it occurs to me, Rory, that as we're training as counsellors, that we're taught empathy. We're taught to be empathic, and empathy is almost seeing the world of somebody else almost through their eyes. We've heard of walking in another person's shoes. Vicarious trauma is the transmission of trauma either from one person to another, and you can be the other. It can be, as you said, Rory, via a news story or a story we heard, or even a comment that somebody makes, which triggers something off. But empathy is being with somebody else. And if we are there being with somebody else and that person has a traumatic event that they are experiencing, that can transmit. That's the whole point of empathy. It can transmit, and we can start feeling that within ourselves. It can start triggering our own stuff. And what happens in that situation is you're no longer there with the client in their story. You're actually using your story or your past experiences, your trauma, as a lens to look at that through, feeling that vicariously. It's so important to recognize that, know what it is, recognize that when it comes up, and then, of course, have some techniques that you can use on yourself, maybe grounding techniques to kind of work your way through that. And then, of course, if you are in placement, supervisor, always a good place to go. Supervisor, Rory.
Absolutely. And I think a good supervisor would say, when you're working empathically with clients, you're walking in their shoes, but maybe worth remember to keep your socks on. Don't lose yourself completely. And I think a good supervisor, should you be struggling or should you find some of the material you're hearing difficult, will be able to walk you out of it. We'll be able to put you in a place where you can regulate yourself. It's not often discussed in the world of counselling, but sometimes as therapists, we have to we have to regulate ourselves. We have to put ourselves in a position where we're safe. And I think a good supervisor will use what's called repatriative part of supervision, will understand what's going on for you, will maybe give you techniques to be able to help you. And I think, Ken, that then leads on to the next stage. I think if it becomes pressing, ever present, then I think that's something maybe to explore in personal therapy. As a supervisor, I've often said, we've gone so far in supervision. I think that this is something you need to look at in your own personal therapy, because it might have stirred the sediment and brought stuff up from, my supervisees past. So supervision, access to therapy, pretty much essential, I'd say.
Definitely. So if you want to learn more as a student of counselling, from a student's perspective of what you need to know as a counselling student about trauma, because remember, it's not taught at any great depth in counselling training courses, because their job, I guess, as tutors is to teach you the curriculum, teach you all the theory, teach you all the skills so that you can graduate. And I know both yourself and myself, Rory, with our supervisees, when they've just graduated, we will suggest trauma training straight away, because it's definitely going to present within the room. So we have this free lecture for you to go and consume, I guess. Go and watch Rory tell you all about it, what you need to know. And if you want to register for that, all you need to do is go to counsellingtutor.com/live. And you can actually register for that. Now, if you're listening to this podcast past the date that goes out, so the date that goes live is on the 15th of September 2024. If you're listening a year later down, go to that same page anyway. It's counsellingtutor.com/live. We'll make sure that we put a replay of that out. We think it's an important topic, and it's a topic that you need to know about, because you are going to see it or maybe even experience it yourself. The National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, or NCPS, proudly sponsor this podcast, supporting students every step of the way. Join the NCPS for resources, training, and a friendly, knowledgeable community to enhance your learning experience. Visit ncps.com. And I guess, Rory, that brings us to the end of Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 308.
He did, and at the top of the podcast, in Ethical Sustainable Practice, we talked about the essential grounding techniques in therapy and pointed to that very valuable page on our website. And if you want a little reminder what that page is, if you go to counsellingtutor.com, go to the podcast tab, look for 308 podcast 308, you'll find that really well-written piece on grounding techniques and a free downloadable handout. So get yourself over there, because it's so important, and I know it'll be of so much benefit in your practice. We moved on to Practice Matters, and I spoke with a real outlier in therapy, a very creative person, Dr. Jessica J. Clapham, who talks about writing and well-being in therapy. And then finally, at Student Services, we came back to trauma and talked about this fantastic lecture that I'm going to give. I'm just self-aggrandizing myself now, kind of saying it's going to be a fantastic lecture, even though I'm delivering it. And if you want to know about that, counsellingtutor.com/live. Go there and register. And if you're listening, I say, in the future, if you're talking about the future, then still go to that page because you'll be able to see the replay. And as always, and at the end of every podcast, I always say this because I really mean it: stay grounded and please stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.